Hi guys, so today I wanted to cover the material for analysis in chapter 17 of the Dressmaker, and again we'll be centering our analysis on how it can be compared with the Crucible. So let's start off with a summary of chapter 17. So we see Mona and Leslie get married, and once again the idea of Leslie not being attracted to Mona, or really any woman for that matter, is kind of brought up here again very, very strongly. The women go to see Tilly for dresses for the ball, and there's basically just a lot of filler, but there is a visitor who comes to Dungata with a job offer for Tilly. We see that for the wedding, Mona wore her bridesmaid's dress, so it kind of reflects her sullied reputation in the eyes of the people of Dungata as well as her own mother, because she's made to wear this rust-coloured dress, and typically when white is worn at a wedding, it's supposed to represent the bride's virginity or purity. We also kind of see this as a sign of the destitution of her family. So while Elizabeth likes to appear kind of bad and bougie, she's broke. So we see that Mona has to wear her bridesmaid's dress to her own wedding. We also see, because it's a quiet ceremony, it's kind of implied that it's an affair that they really just wanted to get out of the way quickly because they wanted to protect Mona's reputation, or more accurately, their own reputation. So when the newlyweds return to the reception, this entire section up to "he was very surprised" on page 160, there's this implication that the publican at the hotel was kind of expecting them to, do the dirty as newlyweds do on their honeymoon, but he was surprised to see that they hadn't. There are also a lot of references here to Leslie not being attracted to Mona in this chapter, because Ham wants to make this really clear that this is almost kind of like a living hell for Mona in a way, at least initially anyway. So there are a lot of references. I don't want to get into all of them because we've looked at a lot of them already, but like one thing that I found really clever was on page 160 when he says, "I have a surprise for you," and oh boy did he, because she did not see it coming that he was not sexually attracted to her at all. And we also see on page 172 that Leslie Munkin held his wife at arm's length. So this is talking about them dancing, right? And it's it's both literal and figurative. So he's literally holding her at arm's length while he's dancing, but it's also figuratively referring to the saying to keep someone at arm's length, meaning to keep your distance from them. What's more interesting to me with regard to Leslie Munkin here is the scene with them falling asleep, where he popped his thumb in his mouth and slept, and you can kind of highlight or mark out that entire section up to the part where it references Lily of the Valley on page 161, because it kind of depicts him as a child. He's kind of infantilized here, and it tells us that in some kind of way there's this, I wouldn't say it's a good match, because Mona obviously isn't too happy with it, but there's this kind of feeling of there being a perfect match for them, at least in the way of ironic punishment or some kind of, I wouldn't say divine intervention, but some kind of fate or some kind of destiny, because they're both portrayed like they're children or infants. So in a way, he seems like the perfect match for Mona. Now, when Mona returns home, Elizabeth says it's not a gift, it's your inheritance, about the check that she gives her. And it shows us that she's fallen out of favour because now Elizabeth has a grandchild to look forward to. And we also, well, you might find yourself wondering how this came to be, because certainly Mona may have embarrassed them, but at the same time, she'd expected Mona to marry Leslie Munkin anyway. So there's almost this undertone of, yes, while part of the reaction is emotional, there's also this calculated reaction behind it where she wanted to offload her burden, which was Mona, onto Leslie. And we see this when she says, "You're Leslie's responsibility now," on page 162. Now, we also see the women of Dungatar trying to organize their own ball, and the creation of their posters is so tacky. It's, glued together from little bits of magazines, specifically Women's Weekly. Now, the magazines that we see talked about in this text, there's the Vogue magazine and there's the Women's Weekly magazine. So Vogue is what Tilly reads and what she gets in the mail, and Women's Weekly is what the women of Dungatar read. So there's this sense of tackiness kind of attached to Women's Weekly here. So, to continue on with chapter 17, a visitor arrives in Dungatar, and we feel like we get this sense that there's some kind of mistake to her arrival. She doesn't seem to want to be there. And we see this when she looks around nervously before asking when the next train out is, and that's on page 163. And we also see that she books a hotel for the minimum amount of time possible in terms of how soon it is possible for her to get out of Dungatar. And we also can infer that she doesn't belong based on her clothing, which seems quite refined. Now, when she kind of enters the town, she sees quote-unquote a fat woman with unsightly hair, and you can kind of mark out this entire spot up to where it says rural province. So there's a juxtaposition of the women's rough appearances with their beautiful clothing, and it really emphasizes how out of place the beautiful clothes that Tilly makes are here, and the oddness of it all. So one of the reasons why this is really highlighted here is because when the woman offers Tilly the job away from Dungatar and tells her you're wasted here, we're kind of positioned to believe that to be true, and we're kind of positioned to not believe that she's being particularly snarky about it, even though it says that she said it with a smirk. And the reason is because we're led to believe that Tilly's talents are truly wasted here, and we see this with the women's rough appearances juxtaposed with their beautiful clothing. Now, on page 167, Beulah Harradine says that Tilly always saves the best fabric for herself. Now, this couldn't be further from the truth, because so far we see that Tilly has only worn one formal gown, and she bought that fabric from Pratt's store rather than getting it shipped in, and we also know that that fabric from Pratt's store, nobody thought that she could make anything out of it. They thought, oh, maybe you can make a tablecloth if you really work hard enough at it. So Beulah Harradine is always, as you know, is once again, as she always is, spreading these malicious rumors about people. Okay, so you might be wondering at this point why the visitor is even included and why she's even important. So on one hand, and this is the least important point of the two, or rather I should say the less important point of the two, it's because it gives us this sense of professional validation of Tilly's skills. So far, the people are wowed by Tilly's skills, but then again, the people of Dungatar have no standards. They're literally the most backwater people you could imagine. I shouldn't say that. Some people watching this might be studying from rural Victoria. I'm sorry. Anyway, now, we also see the kind of, and this is the more important point, we see that there's this kind of sense of foreshadowing in terms of what will happen after the plot has finished. And we know this because of the fact that Tilly says, oh, I just can't leave right now to accept a job offer because there are several reasons why I have to stay here. But we know that at the end of the text, she burns down her own house. She no longer has anything shackling her to Dungatar. And so we almost see this possibility of where she'll go after the events of the novel, as she's no longer kind of anchored to this place. She's not fettered anymore. Now, in the Crucible, what happens after the end of the play isn't really relevant, because what's relevant isn't really as much the plot as much as the ideas that it engages with, and the fact that the witch hunts themselves did happen in the fashion that they did. So the outcome is not important. The fact is that these people turned on each other out of paranoia, out of, this sense of almost fear for themselves as well in order to protect themselves. Now, I do want to say, though, that Arthur Miller does give us some idea of what happens after the play, and that's important because he does it in such a way where it's not really um, thought of in terms of the scheme of the plot. He does it in its own separate way. It's a hallmark of that Brechtian style of writing that we've talked so much about, so I won't harp on about it too much. But it is good to note the different ways in which they foreshadow what will happen after the ending of the texts. We also get this big chunk of text talking about Tilly teaching the people deportment and style. I don't think this is really that important, but I will get into why this is the case later. But what I do think is a slightly more important thing to focus on is the music that she listens to. So on page 170, we see Hamish, Reginald, and Faith visiting her. And they have this kind of disapproval about her taste in music. They don't seem to understand it, and they don't really know very well who Billie Holiday is. Now, Hamish calls it music to hang by, and that's ironic, or rather overapt, because Strange Fruit is a song by Jennifer Holliday, and it's literally about the lynching of African Americans in the US. So they also talk about how, even though her voice is tinny, there's this kind of pain to it, and they have this hesitation before they mention pain, as if they can't quite put their finger on it. And that shows us that they're unable to comprehend pain, at least in the same capacity that Tilly can. And the reason why the people of Dungatar are portrayed in such a shallow way is because, for the most part, we're not supposed to feel sympathy for them. We're supposed to not see emotional depth to them so that we don't get attached to them. We're supposed to see the destruction of their town as just and good. Now, there are several parallels in Billie Holiday's early life and Tilly's childhood, which is possibly why Rosalie Ham chose to use Billie Holiday's music, because Billie Holiday in her early life was actually a victim of child sex trafficking, and there was, I believe, also a rape attempt on her. Now, Tilly's childhood, obviously, it was not sexually exploitative, but we do see this very sexualized description of the way that she was bullied by the other children. And obviously that feels very uncomfortable with us because she was a child when it happened. And I think that really adds to the gravity of the sexual aspect of the bullying that happened to her. Obviously, it's not my place to judge who suffered more, Billie Holiday or Tilly, but it's just an interesting parallel to note. So, here, Sergeant Farrett, on a lighter note, says that Faith's a red sequin kind of woman. So here he's kind of making a reference to her being sexually promiscuous, for those who missed it, and I've pretty much heard, essentially, that wearing sequins before 10 p.m. is kind of like the working class equivalent of the taboo of wearing white after Labor Day. By the way, don't worry about wearing white after Labor Day. That's not really a rule that applies in the Southern Hemisphere, or to our understanding of Labor Day anyway, but we won't get into it. Once again, we see that his kind of joke flies over the heads of a lot of the people again, where he says, us dignitaries always sit together. That's this kind of resigned, sarcastic, I wouldn't call it sarcastic, this resigned kind of joke, or almost satire about the people of Dungatar, where he's just so weary of these people. He's kind of done with them, and he's like, oh yes, us dignitaries. Kind of to make, and he does it to kind of make fun of how pretentious they are. Okay, so in chapter 17, Leslie and Mona, we almost see them as the opposites of Gertrude and William. So their relationship lacks a sexual component, and there's this kind of emotional intimacy that's present with them, but not present in Gertrude and William's relationship. And where Gertrude and William have their sexual relationship as one of the cornerstones of their relationship, it's non-existent in Leslie and Mona's relationship. Now, They also lack money and status, and I'm not saying that Gertrude and William are rolling in dough, but they do have, to some extent, the support of the Pratts, so they're getting by fine. Now, in the Crucible, we see less of these very overt comparisons between characters and couples and whatnot, because it is morally more complex. But we do have one example of it, and that's how Abigail kind of works as a foil to Elizabeth Proctor. So in literature, a foil is someone, um, usually like this nasty, terrible character, who has certain parallels with a good character, and we're kind of led to compare the two in order to highlight the good qualities of the so-called good character. In this case, she acts as the foil to Elizabeth Proctor. So we do see parallels between them in that they're both connected to John Proctor romantically in some way, and we do see that they are deceitful, but for very different reasons. Abigail is deceitful for selfish reasons. Elizabeth tries to deceive the court about John in order to protect his honor, in spite of her personal feelings of betrayal when he cheated on her with Abigail. So there's this sense of parallel between them. We get this sense of similarity, and yet they're kind of polar opposites in some ways. So Abigail kind of acts as the foil to Elizabeth Proctor, who is in a lot of ways the ideal Puritan wife. Now, I don't think there's a word for the opposite of a foil, but we'll talk about the opposite of a foil when we get to Rebecca Nurse in detail. Now, arguably, pretty much a lot of the people of Dungatar act as a foil to Tilly in terms of their kind of lack of worldly knowledge and their lack of refinement and deportment. And that's why it was kind of important that we saw this big chunk of text where we just see Tilly teaching them how to carry themselves like civilized people. That sounds nasty, but anyway. That's basically how they kind of function, where once again they are shallow because we're not supposed to feel bad for them, and they're almost like foils to Tilly, sometimes to people like Teddy. Yeah. Now, in my last video, I talked about areas like Toorak and Prahran, so obviously for people who live in Melbourne, those areas shouldn't be too alien to you, but I do understand that there are students learning this text who come from rural Victoria. So for those of you who aren't too familiar with how the layout of Melbourne works, basically everything south of the Yarra, so places like Prahran or South Yarra or Toorak, Kew, they're considered the good suburbs, which is why it's a big deal when Una Pleasant comes. And everything north of the Yarra is kind of stereotypically less affluent. So that's kind of where the references to Toorak, Prahran, and that kind of area come from, in case you're studying this from rural Victoria. So, as usual, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys learned something. I'll see you guys next time.